Welcome to the AI Lab Unfiltered podcast. I am Drew Veach, joined by Mr. Pete Tarrin.
Hello.
We are at the beautiful Grand Rapids studio of Studio Jefferson, right in Grand Rapids, I should say. And we are powered by Think Tank Thought Leadership. If you're looking to put a podcast together and you need some production help and distribution, we highly recommend Think Tank. We would not be able to do this without them.
No way. Yeah.
Big shout out to our crew. On today's episode, we're going to learn about the biotech industry and how AI plays a role in that. And we're also going to learn about AI in pharmaceuticals and the global economy. Stay tuned for more. Today, we've got a very special guest with us, Mr. Ian Miller, founder and principal of North Sky Software.
Doctor.
Oh, I apologize. Dr. Ian Miller.
We're the worst guests or hosts ever.
I told you this is casual. No problem. This is definitely casual.
I certainly don't introduce myself as a doctor.
Oh, I would.
I
wouldn't allow you to call me Pete if
I would have it embroidered on all my shirts.
Yeah, only people who aggravate me.
So
That's
us
a great way
soon.
to put it. Yeah, by the end of this podcast.
Call me Doctor.
So speaking of Dr. Ian Miller, you have a really unique background. I'm actually looking at my notes because there's a lot of big words in here for me.
They're all spelled phonetically too, if you look at it.
They really are. And it's in big print. Computational biology, biotech, and data science is really the key stuff that you're into.
Yep.
That you're knowledgeable on. And give me some background of how, and why, like what formed all this, like how you started and got into this.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess I'll start from school because that's kind of how I got started and interested. I actually went to Kalamazoo College, so not too far from here.
Yeah.
I studied biology and East Asian studies. And it's a small school, so like really it's more about biochemistry and Mandarin. And so from the beginning there, I kind of had diverse interests, always trying to balance like, am I a scientist? Am I a diplomat? Am I a businessman? I'm not really sure. But I was always interested in biochemistry and in drug discovery and biotechnology. It sort of runs in my family. And I had actually lived abroad before when I was younger in Strasbourg, France.
Oh, wow.
My parents are academics, so we've sort of traveled around a lot. I went to public school there. And that sort of shaped my worldview pretty early on. And in college, I was interested in going back abroad. And this is something that Kalamazoo College is known for. But instead of going to Europe, I wanted to go somewhere new. And there was sort of more and more attention on China. And so I decided to take, Mandarin 101 just to try it out. And I found that I really liked it. Sort of pushed me to think differently. Yeah, Mandarin, as you may have heard, is quite different than English. In some ways, it's actually quite similar in its sentence structure and stuff, but it's tonal. It's not phonetic. You just have to learn a lot of characters. And I decided to study abroad in China. So I spent a semester in Beijing and a semester in Harbin, a northern city, closer to the border of Russia. And I really enjoyed that. I spent a lot of time learning Mandarin, and I got pretty good at it. But I was always torn about like what am I going to do with this. I saw a lot of potential to be in business in China, but I was still drawn back to this interest in science and research. And I had done a number of sort of research projects in universities in the US. And I decided that I would first start with research science, and then perhaps come back to China, sort of build out more of a tech foundation.
Yep.
And so I ended up going to grad school, studying drug discovery at UW-Madison. And my project there was focused on computational drug discovery. And one of the things that I had come to get more interested in as an undergraduate was this field called natural products research. And so natural products are basically bioactive molecules that you would find in nature. So many of the drugs on the market today are some kind of natural product or derivative thereof. Think like aspirin, think erythromycin, a lot of different antibiotics, a lot of anti-cancer drugs are from natural sources. And they're produced either by plants or by microorganisms. And my specialty in graduate school was understanding the microorganisms that make these molecules. And my research project really ended up being more about the genomics data that enabled this discovery. And so we were looking at symbiotic organisms that produce these small molecules that you couldn't really grow in a laboratory setting. There's some organisms you can grow and you can study and you can manipulate,
Sure.
but these have evolved for millions and millions of years in association with a host, somewhat like the human microbiome.
Okay.
And you can't actually grow or manipulate them in the lab because they've shed a lot of their basic metabolic functions that would allow you to do so. They live in close physiological balance with these host systems. And anyways, they tend to make these interesting compounds, these natural products. Some of them have a lot of industrial potential for, to commercialize them as products, as drugs, but you just can't get enough of them. It's very difficult to synthesize them with, traditional synthetic chemistry because they're very complex. They have lots of complex ring systems and stuff. It takes 40 steps to produce them synthetically. And that's just a deal breaker from an industrial process. So anyways, my project was about using genomic information to retrieve the biosynthetic pathways from these organisms so that we could clone those pathways into microbes that were more amenable to laboratory settings. And so it's sort of a long tangent there, but that's how I got into data science, is that these big genomics data sets, the only way to really understand them and interrogate them is with software and data science tools. So we can reconstruct these genetic pathways directly from DNA we get from the environment using data science tricks, basically. And so at the end of my time at Madison, I had built up a sort of toolkit of data science and bioinformatics, and I saw a broader opportunity, a broader marketplace for these skills. And I ended up sort of picking up, contract work, consulting work, and data science projects, tech more generally. And that has sort of led to this career that I have now, which is in software and data consulting for biotech specifically, but it has branched to other areas as well.
How have you seen that the computational part of it change from when you were at Madison to what you're doing now?
Yeah, I mean, the AI aspect of it, the machine learning aspect of it is really transforming that industry, right? I mean, I think deep learning tools were around, but they have advanced dramatically.
Were you using any of those when you were at Madison?
In my PhD project, a little bit at the end. I was also, right after I graduated, I joined an analytical chemistry lab. And I worked there as a staff scientist for a few years. And that's when I started seeing more and more of these tools. At the time, it was still more like LSTMs and CNNs. And the research community was sort of focused on those kind of models. The LLMs hadn't broken through yet.
So they were more in that vertical, specific to that. And so are you integrating the LLMs now more?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So now in the last, I would say maybe 3 years, I'm seeing these LLMs and these transformer models everywhere.
Okay.
And it's the generative approach, right? Because before it was a lot of times it's focused on prediction or modeling, being able to predict certain properties of a compound, you haven't seen this compound before. And you're trying to decide, is this going to hit my target or not? And I can assign a probability to that by looking at other molecules that are kind of similar, but not exactly the same. So that can save you a lot of time. And that was kind of what we were focused on a few years ago. Now it's we're using these generative models to all of a sudden sample tons of chemical space, right? So I was at a conference a year ago or so, NeurIPS in New Orleans. There are two big conferences sort of on my radar. NeurIPS, and ICML. And there was a lot of work in the bio and the biotech space, especially around these generative models and these diffusion models in terms of like being able to sample lots of chemical space. That's, I think, a newer trend.
So when not to be confused, or I guess maybe you can help with this definition. So when like a lot of our listeners, if they're thinking about generative AI, they're thinking about generating an email or even a research paper. If you go so far as doing that, but when you're saying generative models and how they're applied there, how is that actually being applied? Because you're not, the generative LLM is not generating a new molecule.
It is.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the language instead of English is a chemical structure. So you can represent chemical structures as text. Yeah. There's a sort of standard system called SMILES, where you can represent two-dimensional chemical compounds in text. Yep. So in much the same way that you would, like train on all of Wikipedia or something, you could train on all of PubChem, which is a public database of chemical compounds. And not only do we have millions and millions of these various chemical structures, we know something about them from research in terms of like, this one is a good anti-cancer drug, or this one has antibiotic properties, or this one's like really water soluble, or like all sorts of different things. So you can both generate strings of chemical compounds, and this is how you can sort of like generate more space. It's like here, here's the chemical space that we live in, like all the stuff that we've seen before. We can sort of fill in gaps with these models, generating new structures that are like variations on a theme. And so whereas before, scientists were sort of like limited to high throughput screens of like whatever compounds they had lying around, it's like we can now use these in silico libraries, meaning like AI generated molecules, and then run the models that say like, this one, based on what I know about this kind of ring system and stuff, could be a good lead for you. And so then chemists can focus on that one, synthesize that one, and test it. And so it can accelerate that early discovery process.
Are they testing it within the AI space? Like, are they building simulators, if you will?
They do both. I mean, like, you can both generate the compounds and then screen them in silico. Eventually, you have to test them in the lab.
Sure.
But for sure. So they're like multiple sort of stages that you can accelerate this process with.
What's the data on the accuracy of the model to the actual human testing?
That's a good question. I think it depends a lot. And this is where the research is focused right now. Some people are skeptical that these models are memorizing things instead of like truly generalizing. In some cases, that's true. So I think that's still an open question.
Okay.
I can't give you like an exact number. And like one of the things that I've been thinking about technically is this very kind of thing is like, I don't know if you're familiar with the term human in the loop, right? Mm-hmm. Where it's like a model makes a prediction, and at some point there's like as a QC process, and a human's like, yep, looks good.
Right.
I think where the biotech industry is going to have more breakthroughs is where they have like a similar idea in terms of lab in the loop, where they have this iterative feedback process in terms of like, how do you get the most bang for your buck in terms of like balancing these in silico tests versus the
lab
tests. And AI can accelerate that process too through robotics, right? Like, whereas you need people working in a lab pipetting stuff, and that's sort of labor intensive, time consuming, and more error prone. Like tying this thing to robotics too is like accelerating the whole process.
We need to have a robotics episode at some point.
I was just thinking that.
Yeah.
Man, we need to have some of the AI and robots now.
Do you have a favorite, or maybe the most exciting or most surprising use case where something was generated from some of the work that you're doing? You're like, holy cow, I never saw that coming.
I think maybe there's not like one specific thing that comes to mind, but what that makes me think of is drug repurposing. So another active area of research is like finding sort of these patterns you wouldn't necessarily expect. So like maybe this anti-cancer drug at a different concentration has a completely different effect. I was reading an article recently where I can't remember which drug it was, but basically they were using this system and they had found a very effective strategy for someone with MS. And it was like a certain kind of MS, or maybe it wasn't MS, but it was some very related autoimmune disease. And this patient was struggling, like all the medications available were just like not working, not helping. And this lab, I don't remember where they're based, in Toronto or New York. They're focused on this drug repurposing effort, and where it's like instead of starting from scratch, instead of starting from like the whole world of any chemical compound you could imagine, you start with pre-approved drugs that are already shown to be safe. And because a lot of times in drug development, it's like you can find something that kills the cancer, but it also kills you, right?
Right.
It's just like a lot of times drugs, what makes a drug is the dose. Otherwise, it's just poison. And there is a lot of, I think, opportunity in that. I think the challenging part, and in this particular case, they found something that works, something that like the doctor, this AI system recommended a combination therapy of 2 pre-approved drugs from completely different indications from MS. And the doctor was like, no, that doesn't make any sense. But then they tried it, and it was like the guy had immediate relief from these symptoms.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's awesome.
I got to find that article.
Yeah.
And so I think it has a ton of promise in like that kind of space. And the great thing is like, okay, we know these drugs are safe. The challenging part is the commercialization part of that, right? Like the whole pharmaceutical industry is like, it's Big Pharma and it's like blockbuster drugs. Like that's the model that they understand. If they can't sell it for billions of dollars for 10 years straight, then they're just like not interested.
Yeah.
I think some of the regulatory mechanisms need to improve to incentivize this kind of work, because otherwise it's just not going to get the support to make it actually happen.
You mentioned, regulations when you're dealing with drugs. Obviously, there's a lot of that.
Yeah.
But also kind of going back to what we talked about too, a little bit earlier with, the accuracy of the generative or the computational prediction versus the real life application.
Yeah.
So it's got to be, from the machine learning standpoint, and you had shared a term with us in an email, MLOps. And how that comes into play. So what part does MLOps play in that, and how important is that when you're going through those trials?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Because that MLOps thing has been a recurring theme in some of my work, both across tech and biotech. And so MLOps is sort of like the operational system around managing the machine learning lifecycle. And so a more familiar term might be DevOps, right? Like development operations, like the architecture in the cloud and all the considerations to make this system work well. It's the same sort of principle, but focused on some of the challenges that are unique to machine learning. And so when you train machine learning models, there are a lot of different variables that can affect its performance. Like, for instance, the training data, like what version of training data do you use? A lot of times people are continuously collecting data, right? And they want to be continuously releasing new models with the latest data to deal with things like drift in your data. And so you want to, like, if you have a really good model that works in production, you want to be able to trace it all the way back to the exact data set that you have. So the MLOps system allows you to track basically every facet of your model and the metadata around it. And so that's just one piece, right? Like another way is like how you prepare that data, what sort of transformations you apply to it to make it more ingestible or understandable to these machine learning algorithms. And there's like, so many different transforms that you could apply. There's the actual architecture of the model, right? Like how you configure the actual architecture of the neural net, for instance. There are lots of different models to try. And then putting them into production, like as an endpoint. It's like one thing to like train a model on your computer. It's another thing to have it as a reliable software product, because it has, has lots of little software dependencies, just the right version of this and that, and like tracking all of the metadata, and then being able to reliably deploy that into cloud environments at scale, so that like maybe you have a little bit of traffic and you just need a little bit of GPU, but like maybe this thing really takes off and you got thousands of people using it concurrently. You got to be able to scale that. And so MLOps is sort of like the operational system to like handle all of those little things, to have that traceability.
Tell me if this is a bad analogy. So we talk a lot about like using different models for different things.
Yeah.
So if somebody wants to write code, Claude right now is the language model that a lot of people turn to for code, where they might use ChatGPT for content generation, and it changes all the time because new models get released, and now they're the best at this. Is it the same when you're like choosing the models that you're using, and that's part of that MLOps structure?
Yeah. And so like you may have certain kinds of prompts that you're interested in, and you want to like track how well each model does for that prompt.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of like a structured system for you to understand, oh, it was Claude that gave me the best one, or this version of Claude, right? And so it's basically a way to like organize all of this metadata around your models and your data.
How are you handling any kind of introduced bias from the model? Because I got to imagine you're running into it.
Oh, for sure.
At some point.
Oh, absolutely. You have to sort of think of that on the front end, and I'm thinking of it from my perspective. And it's, in practice, it's really easy to fool yourself in terms of like, you think you're getting good performance.
Right.
Turns out the thing just memorized your data set, right? You created a really fancy table lookup. So in the case of, a recent project of mine, I have to think about the correlation of chemical structures. Because, typically the way that you evaluate performance in a machine learning setting is like you split up your data set into a train and into a test split, right? Often it's like you train your model on 80% of the data you have, but you want to know how well it works, not on the data it's already seen, but on new data. So you take that remaining 20% and you say like, compared to the ground truth, how good are your predictions? And this is how you sort of like measure performance accuracy or, recall and precision and such. And to answer your question, like you have to think really carefully about how you create those splits, because if you just do a random split of your data, then there can be bias that leaks into your test data set. For me, it's like if the compounds, if the like scaffolds of these structures, if they're too correlated, if they look too similar in the test set to the train set, then it's going to overestimate your performance. You're going to be like, wow, it's doing great. And then you like try it on a new class of compounds and it's like, this is, a great cancer drug. And then you go and run it in the lab and it's like, no, it sucks.
Yep.
And so it's not biased necessarily in the sense of like, sort of discriminatory nature of a model with certain attributes of people, but it's a related problem. So you have to be really careful about how you manage your data. And a lot of times that means just like trying to understand how much correlated structure you have in that data. And so it's almost like a sort of upfront investment you got to make to like understand how diverse and like the different sort of clusters you have in that training data you've collected for whatever you're trying to model.
And like you said, driving it back to the original model is key, because that's your baseline. And if you're trying to evolve it past that, I mean, you really got to make sure it's evolving past that.
Yeah, right. And data can change over time, right? Like it drifts. And so again, this is where the MLOps is like very helpful, is because like, if I later find out in production that this model has like a huge bias to this class of compounds, then I can go back and I don't have to wonder like, how did I train this thing? I can follow it all the way back to the original data. I'm like, aha, like there's my problem.
Yep.
And it just saves a ton of time. And yeah, I've seen this in the biotech projects. I've seen this in the tech project. This is sort of a line of work that I've done more and more of, and that's kind of a fun, interesting problem for me.
So switching gears a little bit.
Yeah.
I know you got a lot of wheels turning. I can see it.
Yeah.
Switching gears a little bit, going back to China. So you've got literally firsthand experience being in China, working in China, learning the language, underestimating China's ability to innovate.
Yeah.
And we hear a lot of it right now because of they have quote unquote less restrictions of what they're developing right now. And we are putting more restrictions, less funding in ours. They're radically funding it. I mean, I think they definitely see there's a pathway more so than we do. I feel like it's still more of a novelty in this country than it is a future path. You know what I'm saying?
It's similar to a previous guest that we had, Charles L. Wood. He spent some time, I'm pretty sure it was the Philippines. Charles, don't kill me if I got this wrong, but came back with a similar message saying they're investing more in this than when we are in the education system, and it's more pervasive. And he comes home to West Michigan and he's like, this is home to me, but we're behind.
Yeah.
And even if you listen to the narrative of, they use DeepSeek as an example. The whole thing was, they just ripped off our models and put their label on it, and that's how they got DeepSeek, right? So if that's the narrative, of course we're thinking that we're ahead of them and they're just waiting to steal the next thing that we put out. But to Drew's point, like, what's your perspective on that?
I gotta imagine that has been radically changed.
Yeah,
there.
I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I mean, I think we're at risk of getting left behind, basically. I think that narrative was more true 10, 20, 30 years ago. It's like outsourced manufacturing. That's all they do. They just, then they rip us off and they, we're the technological leaders. I don't think that's true anymore. I think, as you noted, the government there is investing aggressively in research and development. And even when I was there 10, 15 years ago, that was clear. There were clear signs of that. At the time, actually, I toured some of the labs there as part of the program. And the people there, at the equivalent of MIT and Harvard there, Tsinghua University and Peking University, they're trying to attract scientists there. They're offering fully funded labs, like impressive salaries, and they're like, please come. Like we will pay for all of your research. We will hire staff for you. Like your housing will be included. And like they were trying to get me to come. And just like a week or two ago, I got a message on LinkedIn from a group at Shenzhen and be like, hey, you got any interest in moving to Shenzhen? Like we're doing a lot of interesting AI stuff here. And for the FBI, if they're listening, no.
Hypothetically, we're saying.
Not interested. But yeah, I mean, I keep hearing more and more reporting about it. I think like we've also been increasingly disconnected from reality on the ground there in the last couple of years. We learned a hard lesson in the pandemic of like how much we really relied on their supply chains, right?
Yep.
We got burned. And ever since then, I think, people have talked about decoupling from China. And I think it is right to think that like we have to think very strategically about our relationship with China. I think there is legitimate national security risk in like having too much of our supply chains there. But I think it's also foolish to just try to turn off the hose. It obviously does not work that simply, right? Like we're seeing that. And it's very disruptive. I wish, There's a lot of dilemmas, right? It's a complex problem. For one, China has the advantage of being a one-party system, right? They're not beholden to like this like bipartisan bickering and like swinging back and forth between administrations. That's my preferred system. I like democracy. I like to be able to choose, but they are not beholden to that.
Sure.
And even if we want to punish them, I think they can withstand more economic pain than we can. So I don't think
that's an interesting perspective right there.
Yeah.
I didn't think of that. You're right. They have a lot more resiliency, I think, than what we recognize.
Yeah. Yep. Right. I mean, like the idea, right, was that, we have the financial leverage here. So if we shut it off, they're going to have no option. It doesn't mean that they won't suffer immensely. They will, and they are, and we are. But I think that they could actually come out stronger because of this.
Yeah.
I mean, they've been getting ready for this kind of thing for the past couple of years.
For a
They've seen
long
it.
time.
Yeah, they've seen it coming. I mean, the first round of tariffs, like that one sent some shockwaves, and I don't think they've ever forgotten that lesson. But I think I'm seeing it in the biotech industry. There's whereas the type of deal making and stuff was mostly around manufacturing, even like 5-10 years ago. In the last year or two, there's actually been a lot of innovation, new drugs that are being licensed by American companies. So like the innovation was happening in China.
Interesting.
Like they came up with a new compound. It's not that like they're better at making it at scale. They're actually finding the new biology and chemistry.
So from the very beginning stages.
From the very beginning, they're getting more innovative, and those investments are starting to pay off. And it's unfortunate because like right now in my sector, it's getting really rattled because, there's a general economic volatility. We've had higher interest rates for a while. So the venture capital community has been really holding back. And now the hits to like research funding at the NIH, the NSF, like I think a lot of people, and it's understandable, but a lot of people who are not in scientific research, like don't really understand the connection between this basic research infrastructure and biotech innovation. It is key. A lot of the work that I've done for private clients involves analyzing public data that was ultimately generated by federally funded research. And so a lot of the innovation comes from that foundation, that corpus of literature. And from a practical standpoint, like, yeah, we're running a huge deficit. That's a problem. That's an existential problem. We got to do something better. But to get research right now is going to make us less competitive. It is like we're going to fall behind much faster. Like our hopes of even just keeping up with China are going to diminish.
Do you see any other countries like in Europe or anywhere else that is on maybe not as aggressively, but on that trajectory where the U.S., because we seem to get tunnel vision in the U.S. where it's like, oh, we're dealing with just Russia. Oh, now we're just dealing with China. And is there anybody else that like is Germany or somebody else going, oof, man, they're really hitting it now too.
In terms of being innovative?
Yeah. In that biotech space.
Yeah. Well, I think Europe is having a moment right now too, in terms of like, who should they trust?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Like for the last 80 years, it was us for sure, but we're making life hard for them too. Mm-hmm. And China is being friendly everywhere that we're not.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
And so this is the risk is that, I think we've forgotten the strength of soft power. And what I was just reading was that now a lot of these European pharma companies are like looking to China instead of the US for these new leads. And it's like, even if we throw up walls, like maybe they don't. And like what I'm hearing from leaders, like leadership in these bigger companies is that like, they don't really care where the innovation comes from. They just want innovation.
Yeah.
And there's just some unfortunate economic dynamics that make it a lot cheaper over there.
Interesting.
Do you think the reduction in investing in this research is because we thought we had a bigger lead, and so we feel like we can take the foot off the gas a little bit, or is it straight up just like we're trying to cut money wherever we can cut money, or a combination of the two?
I don't think it's the first thing. I mean, anyone who thinks the first thing is misinformed, I think. I think it's a general, like, we got to clean house, which philosophically I agree with. And I mean, if I'm being honest, I think it's just like, it's a cultural campaign, right? It's like attack the woke state, and like, you know, public universities are like enemy, not enemy number one, but, you know, like they're high up on the list in terms
They're in the
of
crosshairs.
Like, they're in the crosshairs.
Yeah.
And I think this is just collateral damage, honestly. It's like, you know, you withhold $2 billion from Harvard, and it's like, yeah, it feels good to stick it to Harvard, sure. But they were doing important things. And like, there's some lifeblood there that, like, you, even if you think you can just turn that back on, no, you're doing years and years of damage.
You could think about that for a second.
I know it. Just let that settle a second.
Yeah.
Holy smokes.
I mean, there's real implications here.
The real implications, yeah. It puts me in a difficult position. I think about, like, what am I supposed to do here? You know, like, I want our country to be strong too. I want innovation to be here. I want to be a part of that.
But what's the incentive?
Yeah, but what's the incentive? It's getting harder all the time.
Yeah.
He's not going to China. FBI.
Right. I'm not going to China.
Let's reiterate. Not going to China.
Outside of, you know, where the research is or isn't, what other societal impacts? And again, I'll reference an email that we were trading back and forth. You know, there was mention of universal basic income, and you know, this is further reaching, because, you know, there are tons of people that we talk to. We talk to so many people about AI and implications, and, you know, it's going to take my job. And then how am I going to generate an income? How am I going to buy groceries and
For sure.
you know, pay the rent? So what are your thoughts on where UBI is, and, you know, where that might go?
Yeah. So where this sort of started for me is, I don't know if you remember this guy, Andrew Yang. He was like, you know, he was a presidential candidate a few years ago, and he was one of the ones that stood out to me as like, this guy, he's got an interesting idea. Because he identified, I think, a lot of the same problem as economically and culturally in the US that Trump did, in terms of, like, manufacturing took a big hit, right? And that was really hard on the middle class. You know, things like NAFTA were, like, really impacted the middle class, and it changed jobs, right? All these good, reliable jobs went overseas, and it's been sort of shaking our culture ever since. And Andrew Yang sort of picked up on that, but he's like, but it doesn't end there, right? And there's, like, one strategy is, like, you try with brute force to bring those manufacturing jobs back. That's what we're doing. That's what we're trying. But he was looking further ahead, and I think closer to our time now, which was like, well, what happens when, you know, AI starts to really develop and then other careers get affected? It's not about, like, them going overseas. It's like they're just not relevant anymore for people. And, like, think about the societal impact that's going to have. And he was focused, interestingly, on the time and truck drivers and retail workers. He was anticipating this would be the first place jobs would get really disrupted. So he's like, it's a matter of time before those semi trucks can drive themselves. Yep. And, like, that's those truck drivers. It's like a reliable source. You know, like, you don't need a lot of education necessarily. It's a good middle class job. It pays pretty well. It's not without its downsides. Like, it's hard on your body, but
your family, and you're gone.
You're gone a lot. But you can make 80, 100, 120 more. You know, like, I have a friend in high school who makes more money than I do driving a truck. I was like, huh. And Andrew Yang's like, we got to be worried about these folks. There's a significant amount of people employed by these kind of jobs that, like, could be gone, like, pretty soon. And then what? And, like, that's just the beginning. And retail too, you know, like, a lot of those jobs are like service call centers, like, those are going to be gone. And then what? What are we going to do then? Like, it's not about, you know, strong arming some other country into giving us this industry back. It's just like robots are going to do
within our borders at that point. Yeah.
Right. And so his idea an interesting one, and I'm not saying like this is necessarily the answer, but an interesting thing to think about is like, well, what if we, to deal with this, had some kind of universal basic income, right? And his proposition was generally like the companies that make all this money from these AI models, you would have to tax them, like a data tax, basically, to fund universal basic income. It's like all those jobs that were displaced, like those people have to have some kind of basic income. Otherwise, like it's going to destabilize society. And that's, assuming that would work, that's part of the solution. But a bigger part is just like, what are we going to do with ourselves? You know, like if you don't have a job, like you sort of lose your sense of meaning, right? I think for a lot of people, your identity is wrapped up in your work. And it's like, if you don't have something where you feel like you're productive or doing something for society, like the world's going to be a lot different place. And the funny thing is, you know, he hadn't really anticipated the sort of chatbot agent developments at the time. And ironically, I think where we're seeing the most disruption, at least from my perspective, is actually in software. You know, I feel like before truck drivers, right? Software developers are feeling the pinch, right? If you look at that curve of like the amount of software jobs, even though there's more things going on there, right? In general, like the pandemic sort of pushed like this massive tech hiring boom. But from all of my friends and colleagues, like finding a job in tech and as a software developer right now has like never been harder. And I think a lot of these companies see AI as like, well, we're going to have fewer developers and they're going to be more productive, right? And maybe eventually, like we barely need any developers. It's like there are services out there right now. One's called like Lovable or whatever. I don't know if
It's one of my favorite
tugging
apps.
on Drew's heartstrings with that.
you
Okay, now let's talk.
okay, because like somebody introduced this to me.
Absolutely.
Because I proposed, you know, like I was dealing with a prospective client who ended up being an actual client. And, you know, they had this idea for an app and I was trying to like work with him in terms of like, okay, this is how you would have to like approach it.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh, I found this thing called Lovable. And he's like, I just like put a prompt in and it like generates all this stuff and it looks like it's done. Is it done? I'm like, you tell me, can you use it? Because like if it's done, I'm like, I'm happy for you. That was the easiest thing we've done, you know, but no, not quite. But it's getting there. It's getting better.
And like you said, because I remember that in the beginning too, where it was like, oh my gosh, these truck drivers and these manually operated things. But we don't have, and then it almost seemed like out of nowhere, it was all of a sudden, oh, I don't need software developers anymore, or at least less of them, or this is getting a lot easier. Where the skill set doesn't have to be as complex.
I think
And I think part of that, hold on a sec. And I think the part of that is because the infrastructure of automated cars, and it's one thing to program it and to have the brain power behind it. Then you've got to actually manufacture the physical component. Then you got to have the infrastructure around it, the roads and the protocols on the road handle that. I mean, it's such a big chunk that has to follow through with it, a big domino effect before we get to that point.
And arguably in that case, it's the humans that are the problem, right?
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
If they were all automated, it'd be like way safer. But
Exactly.
it's the chaotic humans that's
and that's
like
been
really
proven
hard,
that
right?
you're going to have less accidents if it's all automated versus people. But we're still going, yeah, but who do you hit, the grand lady or the young one? And it's like, well, if you're human, you're going to hit both. I can tell you that right now. Like, both of them are going to be doomed.
And if the FBI is listening, Ian is not saying get rid of humans.
No, humans are essential.
Yeah.
Wink, wink.
Very good.
But then you look at the software side and it's just ones and zeros and electricity, you know, and it was like, oh, the infrastructure is already there. It just needs to be plugged in, that coding. So that transition just happens so much quicker. You were going to say something.
Yeah, I think we're talking about autonomous semis and software. Like AI in both of those, I think, is at the same place. That semi can get on the highway and go, but when it gets to where it needs to back into the loading dock, a human has to get in there and drive it the rest of the way and get it there. Same with the software. Like to your example, oh, it looks like it's done. Is it done? I don't know. Can you use it? Well, if you can't use it, it's not done. The human has to come in and clean it up. So it's not all the way there. But Drew says all the time, like, this is the worst AI will be. Today is the worst it'll ever be. And it's just going to get better tomorrow. It's going to get better the day after that.
And it is, it is saving me time personally. So in addition to like the sort of machine learning developments that have been helpful, like only in the past couple of months have I really used the code auto completion. But I tell you what, it's a game changer.
Yeah.
It saves a ton of time. Yeah. Whereas like what would have taken me hours, took me 10 minutes. And I'm like, if you add that up over days and weeks, and like, that's significant. That's significant. And it's almost like an ergonomic tool. And it's like, here I am typing away at a keyboard. And it's like every time I'm able to just hit tab instead of like type for 10 minutes, I'm like, that was easier on my body.
Yeah.
All right. We got to wrap this up. It's always when we get excited. We got to wrap this up. Ian, pleasure having you on, man. This has been really cool.
My pleasure.
It's a really cool eye-opener globally of what's happening too, because you've had that experience and looking at it going, this is kind of where the rubber hits the road for the biotech. And that makes a ton of sense, man. Ton of sense. Appreciate you being a guest on here. Tell the folks where they can find you.
If you want to be found.
No. I got a website, northsky.software. You can find me there. I'm on LinkedIn too. I think my handle is IJ Miller too. Feel free to reach out on LinkedIn, or I can share my email with you guys offline too.
Awesome. Appreciate it, man. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
If you would like to know more, and like and subscribe to the podcast to learn more. Thanks, everybody.